On the eve of the coronavirus pandemic, Mishkan hosted a big fat 300-person indoor Purim party. It makes me uncomfortable to think about now, and so grateful it didn't end up being a super spreader event. I'll just say that now. Nonetheless, on March 9th, we knew there was something called coronavirus. It's being caught and spread by people. You know, the CDC had recommendations about how to host events, and we followed all of them. We had hand sanitizer stations. We had signs reminding people to wash their hands for 20 seconds. All the food was individual self-serve. People weren't wearing masks, of course, because at that time we were told by science that masks didn't do anything to prevent the spread of the virus. People were still going to work, going to school, going to synagogue, going to concerts, using public transportation, going to restaurants and bars. So long as we were doing all the right things, what could go wrong? We themed that event, ironically, When Pigs Fly, Purim 2020, a title we thought was cute because we were a bunch of mostly vegetarian Jews throwing this big party at a charcuterie place, the pork kind. But now I look back at us in March with a sense of loving compassion about how little we knew of how our lives were going to change. When Pigs Fly could be the theme song of this year. Or to quote the Megillah, v'nahafochu, and everything just turned upside down without warning. Yom Kippur, not Purim, Yom Kippur, is considered the mirror image of Purim. Purim in March, Yom Kippur in mid-September. And you can hear it in the names of the holidays. Purim, Yom Kippurim, a day like Purim. The thesis statement of these holidays is basically the same. Life is inescapably unpredictable. And so we would do well to consider how we spend the precious time we have here while we have it. As Purim approaches, the existential truth with feasting and drinking and costumes and reading this salacious tale of a little Jewish girl who sleeps her way into power and then saves us all, Yom Kippur goes the opposite direction, right? We remove all of these indulgences, food, drink, sex, nice clothes, even a good narrative, as you'll see when we read Torah next week. But the emotional and spiritual thrust of the holidays is the same. And they're 7 months apart on opposite sides of the calendar, as if to say to us, you must never get too far away in your awareness from this truth, which is that life is utterly and inescapably unpredictable, can change on a dime. V'nahafochu, everything gets thrown into the air and lands upside down. This thing called life is real, and we are often completely unprepared. And so Rabbi Eliezer says to his disciples in the Talmud, make tshuva. Change your life. If you're going to do it one day before you die. And his disciples say to him, but Master, nobody knows when they're going to die. And he says, all the more reason to make tshuva, to change now. And so we gather tonight, Erev Rosh Hashanah, and throughout this holiday season for what amounts to a shortening of the journey between birth and death, a kfitzat haderech, from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, and then of course back to life again as we extinguish the candle at the end of Yom Kippur and head into the rest of the fall holidays. And we examine how we are spending our precious time and money and love and attention, knowing that everything could change without warning. On Rosh Hashanah, we say, Hayom Harat Olam. Today, the world is being conceived, is being born, which I know feels a little out of sync with how it feels to be quarantining right now. But nonetheless, this is the holiday of infinite possibility. And Yom Kippur is the holiday of remembering that we will not be here forever. To put it bluntly, we will die. And Yom Kippur, we abstain from all of these lovely things that remind us how good it feels to be alive. Food, sex, drink, business, right? Gossip, perfumes and lotions, things that make us feel beautiful and presentable. And we clear it aside for a day and live in the space of profound emptiness. And in that empty space, we can focus more clearly and more completely on life's big questions. Who are we if we are not the sum total of all of those, yes, pleasurable, but ultimately fleeting distractions? Ma'anu, ma'chayenu. What is our life really about? These are the questions not just of the high holiday season, but a person lying on their deathbed confronts these questions. And these are the questions that so many of us have been asking during this pandemic as our lives have become more circumscribed and so many of the things that we have looked forward to have been taken off the table, off the calendar, sometimes temporarily and possibly indefinitely. And we feel like we're just stalled, treading water, not even knowing how to move forward. Many people are wondering, if I'm not my job, if I'm not my career aspirations, my degree, then who am I? And if I'm feeling depressed and anxious and lonely and isolated during these times, how can I meaningfully contribute to the world? And these questions aren't just, sort of emotional indulgences of the high holiday season. These questions are matters of life and death. You may know that the suicide rate in Cook County is up over what it was last year. In the Black community, we have already exceeded the number of suicides in August of this year over the entire year from 2019. These questions are matters of life and death. And so Jewish tradition insists that we get together at least once a year for this conversation to find renewed meaning and purpose in our lives, despite and even because the world is so precarious all around us. Every other high holiday season has been a rehearsal for this year. And so, I thought I might offer a framework for making meaning in this time that does not rely on advanced degrees or professional advancement or even leaving your house. The questions I'm going to share with you focus on character and how we spend our time, because while so much is beyond our grasp to control or to predict, these things are eminently within our control. So Rava, a great sage in the Babylonian Talmud, describes 6 questions that a person is asked on their judgment day. Judgment day, by the way, is called Yom Hadin, which is another name for Rosh Hashanah. So rather than believing, there's one judgment day at the end of your life, we just have regular check-ins, regular judgment days, every single Rosh Hashanah. And we can ask ourselves these kinds of questions. So here we go. A person is brought in for judgment, and they say to him, Amar Rava b'sha'a shemichnasin adam ladin, omrim lo, nasata v'natata v'emunah, kavata itim l'torah, asakta b'priya u'reviyah, tzapita liyeshua, pilpalta b'chochma, hivanta davar mitoch davar. Did you engage in business with integrity? Did you set fixed times for study of Torah? Did you occupy yourself with your legacy, with what comes after you? Did you hope for salvation? Was your wisdom grounded in details, which you discussed with people who understood those finer points differently from you? Did you learn one thing from another? So take a second and look at that list. What do you notice about it? What do you notice about the questions on this list? More importantly, if your judgment day were tomorrow, how do you think you'd fare? All right, so if we were in person, we'd do a whole back and forth here. I'd, ask questions of the people I could see in the first couple of rows, and we'd talk about this. As it is, I'll share with you what I like about this list. What I like about it is it riffs off a familiar notion in Jewish tradition, lo alecha hamlacha ligmor. It is not up to you to finish the task. Ve'lo ata ben chorin lehibatel mimena. But you're also not free to desist. None of these questions relies on finishing whatever lofty goal you might have set out, whether personal, for your family, or for the world. These questions are about effort, which you can control. day to day, week to week, year to year, as long as we have time. So I want to look at just a few of these questions, knowing that lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, we're not going to do everything. And so, maybe we'll do the ones we don't do this year, next year. Nasata v'natata be'emunah. Did you give and take with integrity? So Hebrew speakers will see that this question literally is about business, honesty in business. Masa umatan is Hebrew for business. But beneath the surface, this question gets at the heart of who we are, the business of our lives. This question is an invitation to consider how you give and how you take your time, your money, your intention. How do you give and take in friendship, in partnering, in romance? As a person seeing another person on the street who needs help, who sits right outside the Starbucks that you go into 3 times a week to buy coffee and a sandwich. What do you take? How are you giving? We develop these narratives about our time and our money. Usually they're of the I don't have enough variety. Now is a great time to re-examine these stories of how much we have and therefore how much we have to give. It turns out that one of the biggest indicators of happiness is how much we empathize with other people, how much our hearts are connected to the experiences and the suffering of other people, and how able we are to give toward other people's well-being. In the neighborhood mutual aid societies that cropped up as the pandemic got underway, it became clear money wasn't the only valuable commodity. One person would give their stimulus check to another who needed to pay rent on the spreadsheet, and that person in turn might go grocery shopping for a person who couldn't leave their house, or cat sit for a person who was out of town, or volunteer at a food bank. Deploying the scarce resource that so many of us chase after no matter how much money we have, and that's time. Did you give and take with faith? Has no end point, meaning you can make tshuva at any time. It's just a constant recalibrating of energy out and energy in. We can make tshuva by just adjusting the dial, which of course is easier said than done. But as we say every single week on Shabbat, when we get the chance to stop and recalibrate, sof ma'aseh b'machshava tchila, the end result is born with setting the intention. So you might think over this holiday about what you want to let go of. This would be a good tashlich activity as you cast away stones or bread. What might you give away? What might you let go of in order to create space for what needs to come in? Kavata itim l'Torah. Did you set aside fixed times for the study of Torah? Never before in human history has there been so much wisdom and moral guidance of every stripe and shade and religion and philosophy available so freely with the click of a button, swipe of a finger. And yet, I'll just speak personally, I often feel that at the end of a week of what amounts to a diet of internet snacking, of little bits of wisdom, I don't actually feel intellectually or spiritually nourished. I don't feel like more of the person I want to be. Kavata itim l'Torah is an invitation to fix times in our week for the kind of learning that doesn't give us the dopamine hit of finishing a video or an article and checking it off the list or closing the tab. Rather, it's a practice of committing to an ongoing relationship with a meaningful subject whose benefit is cumulative over time. Right? It's learning you could do and do and do and never be finished. This is why Jews are called people of the book. It's like a Torah scroll. We read it to the end, scroll it back, start from the beginning, because we believe there's just always more to learn. Kavata itim l'Torah, a fixed time, the way you affix a mezuzah on the side of your door. It's the same word, so that you see it when you come and go, because it reminds you of who you want to be in the world. So I want to ask, what is a subject area that matters deeply to who you are? Maybe you spent time in college studying it, or maybe when you were younger you explored it and it's been a while. But you want to get back there. You want to get back to that place of having a regular practice, whether it's every day or every week, where you get to dig into this thing. Maybe it's with another person, maybe it's with a group. Even if it's a page a week, maybe it's a sentence a week. So I want to give a personal and specific and current example of what this can look like. Maybe a recommendation for this year. Many of us took to the streets in protest after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were murdered by police this past May. Many of you expressed deeply felt sentiments that you want to be part of dismantling white supremacy now that its effects are so visible and so painful, which they have been as long as this country has existed, but now it seems that it is much more palpable and people are ready to get in the streets and do something. I should say, white people are ready to get in the streets and do something. And you came to me and you said, I want to do this, but I don't even know where to start. Right? Conversations about whether to reform or defund or abolish police departments felt a step beyond, or maybe a few steps beyond, the foundational questions of what it means to be white and Jewish, if that describes you. It describes me. It describes 85% of the American Jewish community. And we never talk about it. We never talk about it. We never study it. Kavata itim l'Torah, right? This seems like it should be something that we are conscious of. In my synagogue youth group, we talked about the overlapping and sometimes conflicting identities of being American and Jewish, right? Being American, we have this calendar. Being Jewish, we have this calendar. We have different foundational values in places. We never talked about race, which is one indication of being white in America. So when I say we, I'm talking about a predominantly white and Ashkenazi Jewish community. We never talked about race. And if you don't need to talk about the implications of your race in this country, chances are you're white living in a country that privileges whiteness. No one ever had to sit down with me and tell me how to hold my hands should a police car pull me over for speeding on Lakeshore Drive or running a stop sign, which happened a couple times in high school because I was a very creative driver. I never once feared for my life or my safety at one of those traffic stops at 1 a.m. in Hyde Park. Even as the stories I carry, the story of my family, the stories that brought my family to America are in fact ones of state-sanctioned violence and oppression. As far as I was always concerned, my race was Jewish because that's what was stamped in my grandparents' passports from Germany and Poland and Russia. But in America, race is overwhelmingly skin color. And mine is white. And I have benefited from a few generations of being perceived that way in this country in terms of my family's access to housing, where they could buy a house, mortgage lending, the rates they got and the mortgage terms, education, jobs, healthcare. This is true for the majority of American Jews. 85% are white, and we don't talk about it, and we don't talk about the disparities in opportunities and in the feelings inside of our community across racial lines. In the 60s, some synagogues and Jewish communities encouraged the Jewish community to stand and sit in with and march alongside and fight with the Black community for equal rights for African Americans. And I say some because it was not all. And we might romanticize that time, but it was not all Jewish communities. That was over 50 years ago. What might it look like for mainstream Jewish communities now to devote time and resources, real time and real resources, right now, unequivocally, to stand with the Black community? People within our community, people beyond our community, our family, our friends, our neighbors, to say Black Lives Matter and to make sure that the privileges of being American are truly available to all people regardless of skin color. Kavata itim l'Torah. We must set aside time and resources to do this. Are we prepared to unlearn things that we thought we knew about ourselves, about our community, about race relations, and open ourselves up to be vulnerable and admit the places where we have to grow. That's Torah. That's Torah. Kavata itim l'Torah. Think about struggling with, reckoning with the hard-fought stuff that defines who we are. So I want to suggest that race and Judaism is an issue that deserves real and sustained time and resources, if not every day, like the 30-day Elul Confessions of the Heart Challenge that we've been doing with the Jewish Emergent Network, if not every day, maybe every week. To learn more about these questions and the implications of race in the Jewish community and beyond right now. And I will say this especially applies if you are in the 85% of people who haven't maybe really thought about how white and how Ashkenormative our spaces are and the effect that has on people and Jews of color, the assumptions we make about what is Jewish, recognizing now that actually those might just be our assumptions based on our experience, or my assumption based on my experience. So I plan to talk about this a little bit more on Yom Kippur. Mishkan has, in the meantime, collectively made a commitment to exploring these questions in a sustained and committed way, whether it's been the anti-racist book groups or whether it's working with Edot HaMizrach, an organization that's going to help us think about how to do more with promoting and cultivating true diversity, the true diversity of the Jewish community, and supporting a flourishing Jewish community in which all of our lives and experiences and backgrounds really are valued. This is not something that one can just check off with a lecture or a podcast. This is a decision to change our lives, to include more learning. And what that does in a community that takes this on is it adds up to a more conscious, more empowered, more informed, ultimately more just community. That's the kind of community we're trying to create here. Okay, now that I've spent like 20 minutes on the first two questions, I'm going to move in the direction of closing with this caveat in mind that we're never really done when we start to unpack and reflect on our lives and what we might do with our precious time in this coming year. Okay, I want to expand our vision outward, and for a moment, think of our individual tshuva, our individual growth journeys, as not just having implications for our own lives, but as being part of a larger Jewish project, and that project is saving the planet. Saving the planet. Yes, the religious word for this is salvation. Not a word that progressive Jews sit around the Shabbat table and bandy around, but tzapita liyeshua. It's one of the questions. Did you hope for salvation? Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, who is a modern Orthodox luminary, writes in his book, The Jewish Way, the central paradigm of Jewish religion is redemption. Life will triumph over its enemies: war, oppression, hunger, poverty, sickness, even death. And in a world of justice and peace, with all material needs taken care of, human beings will be free to establish a harmonious relationship with nature, with each other, and with God. This is not the first high holiday season that our people has entered while it felt like the world was on fire. And in other years, I have found it comforting to remind myself, what we're going through is rough, but our ancestors had it harder. I think anyone paying attention right now knows that this is a moment to take seriously, right? Whether we're talking about climate change, these are, just some of the issues that come to mind for me. The fact that in a decade, at my son's bar mitzvah, we will be at an inflection point for climate change that will determine the future of survival, human survival on planet Earth. And we're not moving in the right direction, right? Our imperiled democracy, systemic racism in America, rising anti-Semitism, an untenable situation in Israel with a Jewish government effectively ruling over two peoples unequally. This is a moment where I believe our ancestors are calling to us from the grave to wake up, wake up. We can't be complacent. We can't roll over and throw the blanket over our head. We should be uncomfortable. But in the words of one of my teachers, Ezra Furman, native Chicagoan indie rocker, despair is not a strategy. Tzapita liyeshua, did you hope for salvation? Did you hold this vision of the world, the one that Rabbi Greenberg describes, at the forefront of your mind? The Garden of Eden. Humanity, nature, and God coexisting harmoniously. Did you hold it in the forefront of your mind with the cognitive dissonance as you look with the very same eyes at the world as it is? Rabbi Greenberg calls this Jewish sense of the messianic perfected world that we have to hold constantly the dream. And by holding on to it year after year, making this the reason why we do whatever we do, we survive. We survive as we work decade by decade, century by century toward more equality and more justice, more human dignity, and more peace. And lest you think that these are just some lefty buzzwords from your progressive rabbi over here, these ideas are taken from the traditional Amidah that Jews have been saying 3 times a day for 2,000 years. Every day saying prayers to restore justice and wise judges, to bring us wisdom, to bring us healing, to bring an end to all corruption and power hoarding and evil rulership and lie telling on the part of our government. Prayers for freedom and dignity. And finally, the Amidah ends with a blessing for peace, as all the most important Jewish prayers do. Holding impossible dreams is what has kept our people alive for over 2,000 years, 3,000, 4,000, in Israel and in the diaspora. And I think this relentless sense of the impossible dream is where the Jewish flair for activism comes from. We have for so long been the ones victimized by the societies in which we have lived. V'nahafochu, and things have turned upside down. Since the end of World War II and the birth of the State of Israel, the Jewish people have never been stronger, had a more public voice or military power or political influence. What are we doing with that power and influence to bring about salvation? And I know this is a question. Maybe it's phrased as tikkun olam or social justice. This is a question that we concern ourselves with. What I like about this question, tzapita liyeshua, is that even in a moment where there is an uptick in anti-Semitism, which we should be concerned about and we should talk about, we don't isolate our salvation as being somehow distinct and separate from the salvation of all people. This is not a particularistic kind of salvation. Our salvation is bound up with the saving of all people, especially of all oppressed and marginalized people. Think of the 36 times in the Torah that we are reminded we were oppressed in the land of Egypt. We were strangers, and to love the stranger, right? We are also bound up with the fate of our planet. And so Rosh Hashanah, getting back to this moment, Rosh Hashanah as Judgment Day, as you'll see from the liturgy tomorrow, it's not just about us, our life, our people's life. The whole world, the text describes, is brought before the Holy One and stands before God to a person, to an animal, like a sheep before a loving shepherd, being assessed. And this is not an abstract concept, like a sort of poetic metaphor. This is a series of questions for us about what we're doing with our resources, what we're doing with our time and our money and our love and our attention. How we learn, how we grow, especially by encountering difference in the world and ideologically and politically, right? How we engage in machloket l'shem shamayim, how we bring our experience into dialogue with the experience of others who see the world very differently and somehow actually perfect the world through encounter with other kinds of people and ideas. There is so much that has been hard about the last year, and particularly the last 7 months. This kfitzat haderech, this shortening of the way between birth and death, places in front of us at Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur the book of life and the book of death. And the text says, we write our own fate with our own hand, or our own keystrokes. So Don't should all over yourself about the things you haven't done yet. That's not helpful. The book is open. We can start now. Right? To quote Anne Frank, how wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world. How wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment to begin to improve ourselves. So for us, for our children, for 7 generations children from now, for our people, for all people, for our planet, let's hold this dream as a sacred aspiration, knowing that it may not be fulfilled in our lifetime. But we, like those who came before us, will work at it day by day, week by week, year by year, decade by decade toward its fulfillment. We don't have any other choice. Despair is not a strategy. L'shana tova.